There are things that a man does in the despair of loneliness that he would never confess in the light of day. Thomas Whitman watched the dusty road that cut through his property like a dry scar on the barren land. The wind carried the smell of sage and the promise of another scorching day in the Arizona territory. His calloused hands held a letter he had read so many times that the folds threatened to tear the delicate paper. A letter he had written weeks ago, when loneliness weighed more than the rocks that surrounded his small ranch. The gray-haired man had spent 15 years building that simple life after leaving behind the turbulent days as a foreman on larger ranches. His estate was not large, just enough for a few head of cattle and a modest wooden house that he built himself board by board. But it was his, and that meant everything to a man who knew the value of independence. The idea had been born on a particularly quiet night, when the distant howling of the coyotes seemed to echo the emptiness he felt in his chest. He had seen other men in the region resort to marriage advertisements in the newspapers of the big cities. Women from the east who were looking for a new life, men from the west who needed companionship and help running their land. A practical agreement, they said, a sensible solution to the loneliness that corroded the soul like rust on metal. Thomas had been cautious in drafting his letter to the San Francisco marriage agency. He described his property honestly, small but productive, secluded but quiet. She spoke of her age, her values, her willingness to offer a dignified home to a woman who knew how to value the simple life. He didn't mention that his savings were modest or that his home needed repairs that he had been putting off. When the answer came 3 weeks later, it brought a surprise that he had not anticipated. The agency reported that a young lady had been interested in his proposal. 27-year-old Clara Patterson, a Boston-educated orphan looking for a fresh start in the West. The letter was accompanied by a small sepia photograph where a woman with delicate features looked directly at the camera with a serene expression. Thomas studied that image for hours. There was something in this woman's eyes that suggested a deeper story than the few lines written about her. It wasn't just beautiful, it was refined, elegant in a way that seemed to belong in the halls of big cities, not the roughness of the wilderness. Doubt began to gnaw at his certainties like water digging up stone. What woman like that would choose a secluded ranch and an ordinary man like him? What circumstances would have led her to seek an unknown husband through a marriage agency? But loneliness spoke louder than prudence. Thomas replied to the letter, confirming his interest and suggesting a date for her arrival. 3 weeks from that day, she would be at the train station in the nearest town, 40 miles from her property. Now, watching the empty road in the midday sun, he felt the weight of decisions made in the silence of the night. In 2 hours, he was to leave to fetch his future wife, a woman he knew only through polite letters and a faded photograph. The cattle grazed placidly in the dry pasture, oblivious to the storms that formed in the mind of their owner. Thomas folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He had made his decision, and men like him would not go back on their word. But as he saddled his horse for the journey to the station, a question lingered in his thoughts like the distant echo of thunder. What did a woman like Clara Patterson really seek in the Badlands of Arizona? The answer would arrive in a few hours, along with the afternoon carriage and the secrets it certainly brought with it. The cowboy secretly ordered a mail-order bride, but a woman too stunning for his ranch showed up. Part 2 Millbrook Station had always seemed too small for the dreams coming by the tracks. Thomas adjusted his hat as he watched the locomotive approach, steaming like an iron dragon against the orange evening sky. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each nervous step on the worn wooden platform. Other men waited too, merchants, farmers, some curious people who made the arrival of the train the most interesting event of the week in that city that barely deserved the name. The shrill whistle cut through the air as the machine finally stopped, its wheels creaking against the sun-warmed tracks. Thomas felt his heart racing in a way he hadn't experienced since the days when he faced wild bulls. His hands sweated inside his leather gloves as passengers began to get out of the cars. First, the traveling merchants left with their heavy suitcases, then some families with children tired from the long journey. Thomas examined each female face, mentally comparing it to the photograph he kept in his pocket. An elderly lady, 2 young women who were clearly traveling together, a woman with 3 small children. Then she appeared. Clara Patterson got off the train with the grace of someone who was used to being watched, but without the arrogance that this could bring. She wore a dark blue travel dress that highlighted her light eyes, and a small hat with an inconspicuous feather. Her beauty was even more impressive than the photograph had suggested. But there was something more, an elegant posture that spoke of refined education and experiences that Thomas could only imagine. She carried a well-kept leather suitcase and looked around the small station with curiosity, not with the contempt he had feared. When her eyes met his, she smiled with a genuine warmth that made something warm in his chest. Thomas approached, removing his hat in a gesture his mother had taught him decades ago. Clara was taller than she had imagined, and her presence had a luminous quality that made the other passengers look faded in comparison. She was the first to speak, her voice carrying a polite Eastern accent, but with a warmth Thomas hadn't expected. She confirmed that she was Clara Patterson, thanked him for coming to pick her up, and commented on the beauty of the landscape she had seen from the train window during the trip. As they walked to their wagon, Thomas noticed how other men at the station turned to look at Clara. It wasn't just her beauty. There was a natural elegance to her movements, a quiet confidence that drew attention effortlessly. He wondered again what circumstances had brought such a woman to the far reaches of Arizona. During the journey back to the ranch, Clara showed genuine interest in the region. He asked about the kinds of plants that grew there, about the wild animals, about how Thomas had chosen this place to live. His questions were intelligent, demonstrating an inquisitive mind and a sound education. But Thomas noticed other things too. The way she sometimes looked back, as if she expected to see someone following them, the way their hands clenched when they passed other travelers on the road, and most importantly, how she deftly deflected questions about her life in Boston, changing the subject with the dexterity of someone who had practiced this maneuver many times. When they finally spotted the ranch at sunset, Thomas watched Clara's reaction carefully. I expected to see disappointment, perhaps regret for having agreed to come to such a simple place. Instead, she smiled with what seemed to be genuine relief. Clara commented on the peace of the place, on how the silence was different from the constant noise of the city. He praised the house Thomas had built, noting details that showed his care and skill, but there was something in his voice, a gratitude that went beyond ordinary courtesy. That night, while Clara settled into the room he had prepared, the best in the house with the bed that had belonged to his parents, Thomas stood on the porch watching the stars. Her presence had transformed his home in some indefinable way. There was life where before there was only routine, colors where before I only saw functionality. But the questions persisted, growing like shadows in his mind. Why had such a refined and educated woman chosen to marry a stranger? Why leave the civilization of the East to come to a place where the nearest city was a lost point on the map? And most importantly, what secrets did Clara Patterson carry in her leather suitcase, along with her elegant dresses and impeccable manners? The answer, Thomas suspected, would change everything he thought he knew about the woman who now slept under his roof. Secrets have a weight of their own, and Clara Patterson carried hers like stones in her heart. The first week at the ranch had passed like a carefully orchestrated dream. Clara adapted to the routine with an ease that surprised Thomas. She woke up before dawn, prepared coffee with skill that spoke of practical experience, and tended the house with discreet efficiency. It wasn't the frail delicacy he'd expected from a Boston lady. But Thomas was an observant man, trained by the years in the West to notice details that others missed. He saw how Clara always chose to sit with her back to the wall during meals, how his eyes moved quickly to the window with each unusual noise, how she kept a small velvet bag always close to her, protecting it as if it contained something more valuable than jewels. On the morning of the 8th day, while Thomas was repairing the corral fence, a lone rider appeared on the road. The man rode a well-groomed black horse and wore clothes that clearly cost more than the annual income of most ranchers in the area. His dark eyes scanned the property with the precision of someone who was looking for something specific. Thomas watched Clara through the kitchen window. She had stood motionless like a doe that senses the predator, her face losing all color. Her hands trembled as she stepped away from the window, and for the first time since her arrival, Thomas saw real fear in her eyes. The stranger did not get off his horse. He just looked at the house for long minutes, as if he engraved every detail in his memory. Then, without a word, he turned his animal and set off in the same direction he had come from, leaving only a cloud of dust and unanswered questions. When Thomas entered the house, he found Clara sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. She didn't look at him when she asked if she knew the knight. Thomas replied that he had never seen the man before, but that something about him did not seem to belong in that region. That night Clara finally spoke. Not all, but enough for Thomas to understand why a woman like her had fled to the far reaches of Arizona. She had been married before, to a prosperous Boston man named Edmund Harrington, a man respected in social circles, owner of an import company that made him even richer every year. On the outside, he was the perfect husband, generous, polite, well-connected. Inside, he was a man who considered his wife to be property, like their ships or their homes. Edmund had started by controlling her friendships, then her outings, finally to the clothes she could wear. When Clara tried to resist, he became violent in ways that left no visible marks. She learned to walk in silence, to speak only when asked, to exist as a beautiful shadow in his life. The escape had been planned for months. Clara secretly sold some jewels that had belonged to her mother, saved every coin she could hide, and waited for the right opportunity. When Edmund traveled to New York on business, she disappeared, leaving only a letter explaining that the marriage was over. But Edmund Harrington was not a man who accepted losing what he considered his own. He had hired private investigators to find her, promising a substantial reward for information on her whereabouts. Clara had changed her name twice, traveled to cities where no one knew her, but always with the feeling of being hunted. The marriage agency had seemed like the perfect solution. A new name, a new identity, a place so remote that not even the best researchers would think of looking for it. Thomas Whitman had offered not only a home, but a refuge. As she spoke, her words coming out in whispers, laden with years of pent-up fear, Thomas felt an anger rise in his chest, not against her, but against the man who had turned the marriage into a prison, who had forced a gentle woman to flee into the desert in search of freedom. Clara looked at him with eyes that begged for understanding, perhaps forgiveness for having come into his life loaded with problems that were not hers. She offered to leave so as not to bring any more danger to her quiet home. Thomas looked to this brave woman who had crossed half a continent in search of a new chance to live with dignity. She saw not the fugitive she thought she was, but a survivor who deserved protection and respect. That night, for the first time since Clara arrived, Thomas cleaned and checked the rifle he kept on the mantelpiece, not out of fear, but out of determination. Some men were born to build fences, others to protect what was inside them. And if Edmund Harrington or his investigators came looking for Clara Patterson at Thomas Whitman's ranch, they would find that the West had its own laws, older and more unforgiving than any paper signed in Boston. The truth always finds its way even in the farthest lands of Arizona. 3 weeks had passed since Clara's confession, and by that time the ranch had become more than a home. It had become a sanctuary. Thomas watched as it bloomed gradually, like a flower that finally finds fertile soil after years of drought. Her laughter became more frequent. Her movements lost that constant tension that made her always seem ready to run away. In the evenings, they would talk on the porch about simple matters: the weather, the plans to enlarge the vegetable garden, the stars that shone with stunning clarity in the clear desert sky. Thomas had begun to get used to the idea that perhaps Edmund Harrington would never meet them. Arizona was vast, and a woman who had changed her name twice could easily disappear forever into the arid expanses of the territory. But men like him knew that peace always has a price, and that price sometimes comes when you least expect it. The charge came on an October morning, when the air was still carrying the freshness of the night, and the first rays of sunlight painted the distant mountains golden. Thomas was repairing a part of the roof that had come loose during the previous week's storm when he saw the cloud of dust on the road. It wasn't a single rider this time. It was 3 mounted men, and from the way they rode, Clara was in the kitchen preparing the bread dough when Thomas came down from the roof in a hurry than usual. She looked at him and immediately understood. He had developed a keen sensitivity to danger signals, like a wild animal that had survived too long being hunted. Her eyes automatically drifted to the window, and she saw what he had seen. The man in front was Edmund Harrington himself. Even from a distance, Clara recognized his upright posture in the saddle, the arrogant way he held the reins, as if the whole world were his private property. He wore expensive but practical travel clothes, and there was something about his presence that made the air feel heavier, more oppressive. The other 2 were clearly men hired for intimidation. One was large and imposing, with a hard expression that spoke of many confrontations. The other was smaller, but there was something about his cold eyes that made Thomas think of a calculating predator. Both had the posture of someone who was used to solving problems through force and intimidation. Thomas picked up the rifle he had left loaded and ready beside the main door, not out of aggressive intent, but because a wise man always prepares to protect what is his. Clara had retreated to the back of the kitchen, her hands clenching her apron hard enough to turn her knuckles white. It wasn't ordinary fear that he saw in their eyes. It was the terror of one who knew exactly what these men were capable of. The three of them stopped at a respectful distance from the house, and Edmund Harrington dismounted with calculated movements, adjusted his jacket as if he were arriving for a business meeting, and walked a few steps toward the porch. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who was used to being obeyed without question. He said he had come to pick up his wife, who had run away from home due to a misunderstanding that could be easily resolved. He spoke about Clara as if she were a mischievous child who needed to be brought back home, not a grown woman who had made a conscious choice. He even offered financial compensation to Thomas for the inconvenience of having sheltered a married woman. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but not aimed, only visible as a silent warning. He responded with the calmness of someone who had faced tense situations before and knew that hasty words could lead to unnecessary consequences. He said that Clara was a free woman, that she was there by choice and that she would not leave against her will. Edmund laughed at the dry sound of someone who finds grace in the naivety of others. He explained that he had spent a lot of money and time looking for his property, because that was how he referred to Clara, as property, and would not return to Boston empty-handed. He doubled his offer of money to Thomas, as if everything in life could be bought with the right amount. Thomas's answer was simple and final. No, Clara would stay at the ranch as long as she wanted, and no amount of money would change that. He respectfully asked the three men to leave his property and not return. It was at that moment that Clara appeared at the door of the house. His presence changed something in the air among men. She was no longer afraid. There was an iron determination to her posture, a strength that Edmund had never seen in her during all the years of their marriage. In a clear and firm voice, she declared that she would never return with him, that she had found a new life and would not give up her freedom. Clara's words had the effect of a slap in Edmund's face. He saw that he had lost not only a wife, but all the control he thought he had over her. The ensuing anger revealed its true nature. The mask of civility fell off, showing the controlling man who had made Clara's life a nightmare. But as Edmund struggled with his fury and disbelief, something unexpected happened. From the top of the hill behind the house, the sheriff of the nearest town appeared, accompanied by two deputies. Thomas had quietly sent a message through a distant neighbor, knowing that the situation could get complicated, and preferring to work things out within the law. The sheriff calmly walked down the hill, greeted everyone present, and explained that he had received information about a possible tense situation. He asked to examine the documents that Edmund was carrying, proving his claim of marriage to Clara. It was then that Clara revealed her card in the final sleeve. From the small velvet bag she always carried, she pulled out neatly folded papers, legal documents she had secretly obtained before fleeing Boston. They were marriage annulment papers, obtained through a discreet lawyer who had documented evidence of Edmund's controlling and intimidating behavior. The sheriff examined the documents carefully, confirmed their authenticity through official marks, and declared that Clara Patterson was, legally, a free woman. Edmund Harrington had no claim on her, and his presence there constituted a disturbance of the peace and possible intimidation. The look on Edmund's face was one of utter disbelief. All his plans, all the money spent on investigators, all the trip to that God-forsaken place, it had all been in vain. Clara had legally freed herself before she even fled, and he had never suspected her intelligence and determination. The sheriff cordially asked Edmund and his companions to leave the property immediately and not return. He mentioned that disturbing the peace was a serious crime in the territory, and that outsiders who came to cause trouble were not welcome in the region. Edmund, realizing that he had completely lost, tried one last card. He offered Clara a substantial sum to return voluntarily, promising that everything would be different. But Clara looked at him with the serenity of someone who had finally found her inner strength and simply said no. The three Boston men set off as they had arrived, leaving only a cloud of dust on the dusty road. But this time, the dust settled on a truly free Clara, both legally and emotionally. In the weeks that followed, life on the ranch took a completely new turn. Clara blossomed in a way that Thomas had never imagined possible. With all threats finally eliminated, she allowed herself to be truly happy for the first time in years. They married in a simple ceremony in the city, with the sheriff himself officiating the union and half a village as a witness. The love that grew between them was different from the novels in the books that Clara sometimes read on long summer afternoons. It was built on solid foundations of mutual respect, shared protection, and the deep understanding that both had found in each other exactly what their souls needed. Clara transformed the ranch in ways Thomas had never imagined. She significantly expanded the garden, created a small flower garden that brought color to that barren landscape, and even convinced Thomas to build a small library where she organized the books she had brought from Boston and others she had ordered from the city. More important than the physical changes were the emotional ones. Thomas discovered that he had a talent for making Clara laugh, and this sound became the most beautiful song he had ever heard. Clara discovered that she had strength she had never known she had, and that she could be loved for who she really was, not for who someone wanted her to be. When the first letters arrived from Clara's distant relatives in Boston, asking about her whereabouts, she answered honestly about her new life. Some letters brought approval and support, others brought criticism for his rash decision. But Clara had learned that others' opinions of her happiness mattered far less than her own happiness. The ranch thrived in ways that Thomas had never been able to do on his own. Clara brought practical knowledge she had learned from years of running Edmund's house, as well as innovative ideas to improve the productivity of the estate. They expanded the herd, improved the irrigation of the garden, and even began to supply produce to the nearest town. A year after the wedding, when Clara was pregnant with her first child, they received an unexpected visitor. It was a Boston lawyer, bringing news that Edmund Harrington had faced serious financial difficulties upon his return. Apparently, his erratic and obsessive behavior had alienated important business partners. The lawyer had come to offer a generous agreement for Clara to renounce any right to the marital property. Clara signed the papers without hesitation, renouncing any financial connection to her past life. "I didn't want or need anything from that world." He had everything he needed there, in that piece of barren land that had become the most beautiful place on earth in his eyes. At night, when the wind blew through the distant mountains, bringing the scent of sage and the promise of another dawn in the vast and free territory of Arizona, Clara and Thomas would sit on the porch he had enlarged to accommodate 2 rocking chairs. She rested her hands on her womb where new life grew, and he contemplated the miracle of having found not only a companion, but a true partner for life. The loneliness that had motivated her letter to marriage agency had become but a distant memory, replaced by the warm presence of a woman who had proved to be even stronger and braver than beautiful. Clara Patterson Whitman had found her place in the world, and Thomas had discovered that sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in mystery and delivered down the dusty tracks of fate. And when their son was born the following spring, weeping vigorously to announce his arrival into the world, Thomas and Clara knew they had created something truly precious, not just a family, but a legacy of love built on the courage to start over and the wisdom to protect what truly matters. This story shows us that sometimes the greatest transformations are born from the most unexpected moments in life. Thomas and Clara proved that courage, determination, and true love can overcome any obstacle, even in the most arid lands of the American West. Their lives intersected through a simple letter, but together they built a future that neither of them could have imagined alone. If you enjoyed this exciting narrative of the Old West, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the exciting stories we tell.